without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Amy Wallman-Nesseth is in her 8th year as a program coordinator for the Northwest Wisconsin Healthcare Emergency Readiness Coalition. Her interest in emergency preparedness came out of her work and service with the Spiritual Disaster Response Team of the American Red Cross as the coordinator for the Chippewa Valley Emergency Support Services Critical Incident Stress Management Team and as one of the Eau Claire Fire Department chaplains. Amy has 26 years of experience in ministry and served as a board-certified professional chaplain in the critical care and emergency department settings in both Eau Claire, Wisconsin and St. Paul, Minnesota. She has a master's degree in leadership with an emphasis on crisis management and emergency preparedness. Brian Kazmarski is in his 17th year in the world of public health and currently serves as the Wisconsin statewide Healthcare Emergency Readiness Coalition coordinator. His past roles have included being a 2-time public health accreditation coordinator, director of the Western Wisconsin Public Health Readiness Consortium, the Wisconsin Department of Health Services statewide training and exercise coordinator, and a public health director, health officer for a level 3 health department. Prior to entering the field of public health, Brian was a secondary school educator. So with that, Amy and Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tony. We really appreciate the invitation to be a part of this series. Brian and I, in conjunction with all the things that Tony just read, we have started a business called Optima EP. And so that's really what we're here as today, is the co-owners of that and the emergency preparedness consultants as part of that. If you can go back a slide. We also want to just clarify for anybody that is not in Wisconsin, a healthcare emergency readiness coalition is the same thing as a healthcare coalition. Wisconsin had to be unique, and so they decided to change that name. But if you come from Wisconsin or Minnesota or Michigan, when we talk about healthcare emergency readiness coalitions, we're talking about healthcare coalitions that are funded through the hospital preparedness program. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Amy. I'll run over objectives for everybody. We won't spend a lot of time on this because we want to really get into the meat of the webinar, but we're going to do a high-level flyby of the 9-part series and the different topics that we'll be covering. You're going to hear the word culture a lot. And I'll explain that a little bit more. Both Amy and I will when we get into the presentation, but I like to look at a spectrum of your facility has a climate, an environment, and a culture, and they're all connected to each other. And all of the agencies that you represent are somewhere along that continuum. And our goal is to nudge towards that culture piece. And that's when things really become embedded. And our focus, of course, is emergency preparedness. And our goal is for you to create a culture of emergency preparedness. And we're going to share some ideas of how you can kind of nudge your facility along that spectrum. We'll talk about the correlation between disasters and the impetus for changes in emergency preparedness. That's that Appendix Z piece. We'll talk about how creating a culture of preparedness builds confidence for, and this is really important, it's not just your staff, your residents, or your clients, your patients, but it's the families of those that you're caring for as well. They have an expectation that their loved one is going to be taken care of in good times and in times, heaven forbid, that something does go wrong. So that expectation is there as well. And then lastly, I would really like the people on this call to leave with an understanding that emergency preparedness isn't this big giant monster that we have to check a bunch of boxes for, and it can be daunting and overwhelming. Emergency preparedness is a fancy term for QI. It really is quality improvement. It's just quality improvement that's focused on what do we do when that big bad thing happens. Next slide. So high level flyby, as Tony mentioned, we are on part 1 of a 9-part series. I believe for the most part, they go every other week. And you can see that next week, next session, we're going to be talking about Appendix Z. And then we're going to get into risk management in emergency planning, health equity in emergency planning, health literacy in emergency planning. We're going to talk about succession planning. One of the most difficult things for a successful agency to do is to not have a letdown in performance when you lose key staff or any staff in reality. And succession planning is one way that you can maintain your level of performance as people come and go from your staff. And then we're going to get into a little bit of resilience and specifically how to be resilient coming out of essentially the last 3 years of unprecedented times in the world of healthcare. The 8th session is going to be on the nursing home incident command system. That one is an edge of your seat one, so bring your popcorn for that one. And then lastly, we're going to talk about probably the worst fear for the types of providers and facilities that are on this call. What do you do if you need to evacuate your facility? And I want you to think of that one sort of 2 ways. You could actually be the facility that, due to the event or the circumstances, ends up being the one that has to evacuate. Or on the flip side, you could actually become a recipient facility. So there's 2 ways to think about that. You're either thinking about getting people safely out of your building, or potentially you could be looking at a surge of patients coming into your building. So we want to be prepared for both of those scenarios. Next slide.
So today we're going to be talking about culture. And I don't know about you, but I remember learning about culture in elementary school and all through primary school about, culture is determined by language and ethnicity, all of the things that are listed here on the slide. When I became a professional working in, first of all, a local parish church in southwestern Wisconsin, but then also in Eau Claire in the world of professional chaplaincy, and also over in St. Paul at Regents Hospital, the whole concept of being culturally aware or culturally sensitive became really important, especially when I was working with families that were going through intense times of crisis or intense grief. The way that you approach a family who is grieving that is from the Hmong tradition, a traditional Hmong culture, is very different than how you speak to the elders in an Amish community. And you can plug in whatever community you have around you, but you all have experience with working with those different individuals as well as family members from a variety of cultures in our professional lives. We think about, anything that comes out of Charlie Barron's, right? The Manitowoc Minute. He's perfected the ability to make fun of Midwestern culture. And all of those are important as we think about how we move forward in our professional careers and what our culture looks like within our organizations. And I challenge you all to think about some examples of culture within your own organization, and we'll move on beyond that. Next slide, please. Some other examples of that is your corporate culture. As Tony mentioned, I worked as a fire chaplain for the Eau Claire Fire Department. And there is a culture that comes with that fire department. They tend to live with each other. They tend to spend more time with each other than they do with their own families sometimes. The fire culture is very different than, for example, a law enforcement culture. They're used to being on their own, being the solo, they have to depend on themselves because they often ride by themselves. It's a very different mindset. It's a different approach, different personalities, different cultures. We also know that that's true in the corporate world. Those of you who are familiar with the Toyota way, they really developed that whole concept of lean processes and continuous improvement. Southwest Airlines, when they first came into being, were known as goofy and fun and dedicated airline to work for, at least prior to the debacle that happened this last Christmas when Southwest ended up having all sorts of trouble. So there's this concept that your culture is your brand. So I asked the question, what is your corporate culture, whether you're a hospital or a nursing home or a home health care agency? And how is that culture defined? It may have to do with the policies and the way that you market yourself with employee retention or lack thereof, rules of engagement. How does your leadership create a culture of openness and willingness to hear from every level of the organization? How is performance management part of your culture that you have created within your organization? Next slide, please.
So we talk a little bit about a lot of times when you walk into the entryway of buildings, not just healthcare facilities, but think any business in general. A lot of times they'll have some sort of a plaque up that talks about their mission, their vision, and their core values. And really, it's the core values that create your culture. So think of the norms that happen within your facility, within your four walls on a day-to-day basis. That to somebody that's coming in for the first time, that's what they are going to perceive as the climate of your particular facilities. And climate can feel several ways. It can feel warm and welcoming. It can feel cold. But climate is sort of this status quo of how your facility operates in those areas that really aren't seen. It's hard to see a culture. But the way that culture climate feels really influences the behavior of the people within that facility, powerfully influences them. And as we mentioned, it's invisible. So very often it's difficult to measure. How do you measure that a work environment has a healthy culture or a positive culture? The other thing is inertia gets in the way. And it is very difficult to change a negative work climate or a negative environment. A lot of people try to go down the road of performance management and quality improvement. And Amy and I have seen this in multiple different provider types that we go into, that they have a strategic planning meeting and they're all fired up about their new mission, vision, and core values. And we come back 2 or 3 months later and their climate is exactly the same as it was, or it actually got worse. So it's easy to talk about. It's very difficult to change a climate into a positive culture. One of the analogies that I like to use is I've coached high school athletic teams for many years. And when I walk into either a new season or into a new school or a new sport, what I'm walking into is I'm trying to measure the climate of those kids, those student athletes, of the administration. And most coaches' goals really, they come in and they don't expect to be successful right away. They come in with a 3 to 5 year plan because they know that whatever they're walking into, it is going to take time to create an environment that is conducive to turning something into a positive culture. So that's just another analogy that we can apply to why is it so hard to turn some of these agencies around or these negative climates around? Next slide, please. So a few of the areas or the buckets that you could be thinking about, you know, how you would measure culture within your facility. Think of it from a safety perspective. Yes, you have auditing agencies and oversight agencies that say you have to do X, Y, and Z regarding safety. But is it perceived that way by your staff? Is it perceived as this hammer is above us, and if we don't do these safety things, we're all going to get in trouble? Or is it really embedded and taken to heart that people are constantly on the lookout for how to do safety better? If it's the latter, you have a positive culture within your facility for agency. Now apply that process or that analogy to the same bullet points that you see on the screen. How about quality of care? Is there a top down and bottom up approach that we are going to go out of our way to always look for ways to increase our quality of care? That's QI. How about leadership? I can assure you that embedding a culture of preparedness into your agency will fail miserably if your leadership does not truly buy in. And Amy and I have seen this, and I want to really caution those that may be in leadership that are on this call. Your staff will very quickly identify the difference between talking the talk and walking the walk. And what I mean by that is they have to see that you're invested and you're going to go through the same processes as the rest of the staff, then they're going to buy into that concept. And then the other pieces are your priorities. So in the world of emergency preparedness, which is relatively new for the provider types that are on this call, the lights and sirens responders and the public health and the hospitals, they've been in this world for a longer period of time. Think about your culture and your priorities right now. How do you view preparedness? Do you view preparedness as this is just another requirement? This is just another program? I know when I was in public health and the preparedness program came out, it was literally viewed as another program, similar to Birth to Three or reproductive health or environmental health. And it was treated as its own entity, almost like its own little program doing its own thing. And that's how it was viewed for many years. And now what we see as best practices in a lot of facilities that we would consider, role models for preparedness is it's not a standalone program. It is embedded into all of the other functions and activities that your facility performs. And then the last piece I would challenge you before I turn it back over to Amy is, again, liken preparedness to quality improvement. It's essentially the same thing. Therefore, is quality improvement a core value? Is your agency constantly looking for ways to do things better? And that often requires asking difficult questions. And when we talk about environment, if you don't have an environment where staff feel that it's safe to ask those difficult questions, you're never going to get to that culture point of quality improvement because people are going to hold back because they're not going to feel safe enough to bring those issues that they're seeing forward. Next slide.
So disasters and emergency preparedness have a very obviously tight relationship. And I haven't been in the business as long as Brian has, or as many of you have been, but in the last 20 years or so, we've had some very significant national events that have raised the awareness of the need for emergency preparedness. And there have been a lot of consequences to those experiences. So obviously, September 11th was a huge wake-up call for our country and for people within authority to recognize that we may not be as ready as we thought we were. that it was the time when the creation of the hospital preparedness program came into being, because there was this recognition that, yeah, emergency preparedness was always something kind of in the back of our minds, but we didn't have the supplies, the staff trained, we didn't have the resources or the collaboration that was needed to really have an effective response to something like terrorism within our country. We started to make some improvements, and then Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005. And that was another wake-up call and demonstration of the failure of some organizations to prepare for things like natural disasters. And of course, it was something above and beyond anything that New Orleans had experienced in recent memory. If you have not read the book 5 Days at Memorial, I strongly encourage you to check it out at the library. It is a very difficult story to read in the sense that it talks about the kinds of decisions that staff had to make at Memorial Hospital when they were cut off from all resources for several days, and the kinds of decisions that they had to make. Now, that's an extreme example. It's not something that hopefully we will ever have to face in the upper Midwest in terms of a hurricane, but it is something that we all, it's full of great lessons learned and reminders of how key and important emergency preparedness is. The other thing that we really have learned over the last 20 years is it's not a if or when question. It's really a when it happens, then what are you going to do about it? We know, no matter what your political persuasion, that climate is changing. It's just something that happens, and we're seeing some rapid changes and weather events that come out of that. We all know that infectious disease, anybody that's been around in this business for the last 2 to 3 years knows that infectious disease is a huge piece of the work that we've been doing. You only have to turn on the television to hear about acts of violence, cybersecurity, power outages. These are all very real threats that we face in this part of the country. Next slide, please. So just some examples. These were some headlines that we pulled. Just an example of some things that had happened in Wisconsin primarily, but you can imagine that these all have happened in your communities. If it hasn't happened to you, it's happened to someone you know of, or someone or some facility that is in a neighboring county. So evacuations because of gas leaks or because of fires, or even things like sprinklers bursting, having some sort of issue infrastructure wise that results in losing internet or losing the electricity or causing the need to evacuate. Those are all very real things that have happened and could happen. Next slide, please. So there have been some significant shifts in our culture, both as a country, but hopefully as a community, and hopefully within your personal life as well, because of disasters. So if you'll click the next slide, there's a few things. If I say, if you see something, what do you automatically say? Say something, right? If you see something, say something. That is something that has become embedded in our culture since 9/11. It's been a successful campaign that Homeland Security created 20 some years ago that has become embedded into our culture. There's a few other examples there. All of the states have what are called Be Ready campaigns. A lot of them come out of FEMA and other emergency preparedness federal agencies. There's also a campaign called Stop, Think, and Connect. That is a more recent one that has to do with cybersecurity. And I think there's one more. I went on a trip a couple weeks ago, and this was a new one for me. The FAA had signs posted all over the airport that said, think twice, be nice. Now, what events have been spurring that kind of campaign? It's because of all the situations we're hearing about in the news about passengers that are being bad and are being caught on viral videos and kicked off planes. So they've started this new campaign again. It's a response to what could be described as a disaster if you're the person sitting next to this upset individual. Another campaign to try to shift that culture to make us all nicer when we're flying. Next slide, please. We've also seen some very tangible changes because of this shift in culture. So in the past, 20 years ago, as Brian made a comment to, emergency preparedness was not a revenue producing department. In fact, it still isn't. You can't charge for your services if you're in the world of emergency preparedness, but there are cost savings. If you have your decon team trained and ready to go, you are less likely to be experiencing a fine from OSHA, right? If you have your plans ready to go for evacuation or for fire suppression or for any number of things, you can save money in the long run because you don't waste as much time. You have your policies and procedures in place. You have memorandums of understanding, and you have the ability to get through that emergency situation more quickly. In the past, emergency preparedness was other duties as assigned. Now we do have standards for emergency preparedness professionals, and not every agency is able to hire a full-time emergency preparedness professional. A lot of our hospitals in particular, but I know in the other facilities and organizations that we have represented here, it's still one of the multiple hats that people wear. But we have seen a shift in that, and hopefully that will continue to improve as time goes on. In the past, emergency preparedness was 100% grant dependent. Hospitals, nursing homes did not dedicate budget line items for emergency preparedness supplies. And if you think about it, it makes sense in some ways. You may be purchasing equipment that will never be used. But again, if you don't purchase that equipment and have your staff trained, that's going to become a huge expense if and when you need it. So we're seeing more and more organizations actually create line items in their budgets for emergency preparedness. It used to be just a good idea and not mandatory. Now we know that CMS and other accrediting agencies are requiring standards for emergency preparedness. And it used to be the responsibility of just a few people. And now it has changed to being a responsibility for all. That see something, say something is not just for the administrator or for the safety officer. It's for every employee within the organization. Next slide, please. So if you look at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services emergency preparedness ruling, their goals are very clear. It's safety, quality improvement, and collaboration. And just for a reminder for everybody, we all remember when this first came out, right? September of 2016 is when the first ruling came out, and surveyors were able to cite for anything that was not in compliance, starting in November of 2017. Since then, we've seen some revisions. There was the Burden Reduction Act of 2019, and then COVID hit, right? And so a lot of surveys were suspended during those initial months of COVID. And then they learned some lessons during COVID, and they put out Appendix Z, which will be the topic of our next presentation on February 16th in March of 2021. We know a lot of you were so busy responding to COVID that many of you have probably not even read Appendix Z. Even though surveys have now started up again, there's a lot of catch up that a lot of organizations are doing. But the goals are very clear, and this is the culture that we're trying to embed within this emergency preparedness climate. Next slide, please. The other thing that Brian mentioned early on is that there are expectations. I was thinking about this the other day. People that are maybe in your facilities now in their 70s or 80s were in their 50s and 60s when 9/11 happened. So they have matured into the next chapter of their life with the expectation that emergency preparedness is embedded within our culture as a community and as a country. I think that makes a difference, especially think about the children of the people in your facilities or the clients that you may care for. And I know that I'm overgeneralizing that age group, but people my age, 20 years ago, again, in my 30s, my mother is now in her 80s, and I do have an expectation that wherever she receives care, they are ready for an emergency. And so it's not just the box that needs to be checked, but it's the right thing to do. And it's something that our residents, as well as our patients, as well as their caregivers, their families, expect to have happening. And it is something that knowledge equals power, right? And so when we feel like we understand what the rules are and when we understand what the plan would be, that does give us power. And that's a really important aspect of building confidence within the community. Next slide, please. This is a quote that Ben Franklin often gets thrown up in any emergency preparedness presentation, but by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And our goal, not just today, but in the presentation series, is to help you become that hand stopping that dominoes. When bad things happen, the dominoes start to fall, right? But if you have plans, if you have protocols, if you have trained staff, you are able to put your hand in the midst of that domino train and can stop things and can get back to recovery and back to your essential services as fast as possible. So we hope that this presentation, as well as the series, will help you feel like you are more prepared so that you aren't in that situation of being caught behind the 8-ball. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Amy. As Amy talked about, when the big bad thing happens, and that the reason I use that term is you've probably heard the concept all hazards planning. And so we don't necessarily know or care, to be honest with you, what the big bad thing is. The functions that we're going to need to perform and activate are likely going to be the same. So we always tell people, plan and prepare for functions and not necessarily specific events. So where in the past, it would have been very normal to see a tornado response plan. Now we're seeing more best practices of what is that tornado going to cause us to do? May we have to shelter in place? That's a function. May we have to evacuate? That's a function. And you can imagine that when the big bad thing happens, you're going to get a surge in the work that is needed to be done to care for your patients and residents. And it really does start with personal preparedness. And what I mean by that is this: if your staff can't be there, you're going to fail miserably, or it's going to take a much longer extended period of time to successfully respond to whatever that event is. So individual and family preparedness, I know a lot of times people got sick of hearing that, build a kit, be informed, have a communications plan, make sure that your kids can be taken care of, your pets, things like that. But the simple fact is that is done to build a foundation so that when you get mobilized and have to report, you're able to do that. And the best example that I'm going to give for that, and all planners, this is sort of a gold standard assumption for planners. When the first SARS outbreak happened, it got as close to the United States as Toronto. And they did a very in-depth study that in Toronto, 40% of the healthcare staff did not show up to respond to that first SARS outbreak for a number of reasons. Number one, they were scared that they would bring the illness home. Number two, they were impacted by it themselves. And number three, they didn't have individual and family plans in place to be able to respond. So literally, when you're doing your response plans, plan to respond with about 60% of your staff. That's what you're going to get. Next slide. This is the QI piece that Amy and I have been talking about, and it's the culture that we really want to try to embed. This is called the emergency preparedness cycle, and it mimics quality improvement cycles. I'm going to give you an example. Let's start at the top with prevention. Prevention these are activities that you're doing on a daily basis within your facilities, both structurally and with your clients. The things that you can't prevent, you're going to try to mitigate. You're going to try to reduce the likelihood that they're going to occur, or you're going to try to reduce the impact if they do occur. The things that you can't prevent or mitigate, that's where your preparedness planning comes in. So those are the pieces that we can't prevent this from happening. There's still going to be some mitigating factors. This is where your preparedness plans come into place. When the big bad thing happens is right between the yellow and red, okay? When you start your response, you're activating the pieces of your plans that are relevant to that response. We want that window of response to be as narrow as possible. And what I mean by that is, think of the disaster as that famous bell-shaped curve. Everything's a bell-shaped curve. But as Amy mentioned when she was talking about cost savings, if we can successfully and efficiently respond to whatever that big bad thing is, we're crushing that bell-shaped curve down and we're decreasing the length of it. And that's causing two things to happen. It's less of a period of time where we're losing revenue, and it's less resources that are being used to fix whatever was broken. So there is literal cost savings in this process. And then lastly, that recovery piece that's where you identify corrective actions and you do an improvement plan. Because I guarantee you through that process, we are all human and mistakes will be made. And it may not be something to the extent of being an egregious mistake or an intentional mistake. Nobody's saying that. That's not the environment that we're trying to create. What we're trying to do is say, could we have activated this sooner? Could we have called in XYZ partner sooner? You did things correctly, but could they have been done more efficiently? Could they have been done in a different process or a different prioritization? That's the type of QI that we're looking for. Creating that culture where you can bring up, hey, I think at this point in the response, it would have been more efficient for us to do X, and have the ability for staff and administration to objectively look at that and go, that probably would have worked better. That's the type of environment that we're hoping we're trying to create here. And that cycle of identifying the corrective actions just feeds into the next cycle. Next slide, please. So again, really, this is quality improvement, and the statement of do the best you can until you know better. And as soon as you know better, fix it. That's really the environment that we're trying to create. And that has to be from the top down. The lowest staff member on your organizational chart needs to feel empowered enough and safe enough to go to anybody above them and say, hey, I saw this, and I think we should do something about it. Then you've created a culture where everybody feels like they can contribute to that concept of preparedness. Next slide. So we talk about quality improvement and lessons learned from COVID-19. Really now after COVID-19 and Ebola and monkeypox and all of the different things that are going out and happening right now, we're starting to hear the terminology of emerging infectious diseases, or EIDs. And here's some of the big buckets of what we learned during the COVID response. There were gaps between local, state, and federal authorities when it came to communication. There's also confusion. A lot of it, especially early on, guidance was changing not only on a daily basis, but sometimes multiple times a day. And you, as the recipients of that guidance, needing to be able to implement it, I'm assuming that was a tad frustrating for you. We all knew that we were dealing with scarce resources for multiple reasons, and we had to make adaptations in order to make it work. We knew there were staffing shortages, and it took us a while to get caught up to be able to try to supplant or supplement those staffing shortages that we had. There were areas of screening and testing where we could have done better. Maybe there were times where we came in too hard, and maybe there were times when we lifted restrictions too early. And we all know the mental health aspects of those restrictions and how it impacted our residents as well. Isolation and quarantine procedures, again, the more we learned about the disease, the more we were able to fine tune those. And again, that's the concept of preparedness. Learn as you go, learn as you go. Why was guidance changing so frequently during COVID? Because we were constantly learning new things about the disease. The public got very frustrated. Healthcare got very frustrated because guidance was changing all the time. But the reality is we were continually implementing the new things that we learned. We were doing QI. And hopefully lessons learned from COVID have been learned and built in to your response plan so that the next time this happens, and it will be more efficient because of the lessons that we learned. Next slide. So sort of a review here. When we talk about culture, and again, we're talking about the culture of embedding preparedness, which is in reality is QI. Understand your expectations. Your expectations should be from top to bottom. People are going to buy into preparedness and not be afraid to, quote, see something, say something. Agree on your vision and shared values. Create that safe environment. I really think if you walk away from this presentation with nothing else, that environment piece is key, because without that safe environment, people are not going to come forward with things that they've identified. Understand and recognize to your staff that we will make mistakes. You are allowed to make mistakes, and you're encouraged to evaluate them and bring them forward, not from the concept of it being punitive, but from the concept of improving it. Your training and education, that's a key part of Appendix Z that Amy's going to talk about next week. Collaboration at every level. Titles should mean nothing in an agency when it comes to emergency preparedness and response. I talked about that lowest person on the org chart. They should feel just as empowered as the director of nursing or the CEO of your facility when it comes to that culture of preparedness. And then practice, test, get involved with the exercises that are happening within your jurisdictions. Get to know your local public health people, get to know your local emergency management people. They have exercise requirements. Piggyback on top of their exercises, and it gives you multiple opportunities to practice. And then critique process, don't critique people. Generally, when you see human error, it's because they weren't trained well enough in the process. So look at process improvement versus needing to train up individuals because they didn't necessarily have the education and training that they needed. Next slide. Amy, I believe it's handed off to you.
Yep. So another way to do this is to think about creating emergency preparedness champions within the organization. And again, many of you may not have the budget to support someone that is dedicated to emergency preparedness. In fact, I would argue that probably most of you don't. But somebody within your organization has a passion for this. Maybe they also are involved in EMS, or maybe they have a child that's in EMS, or maybe they just find it really interesting, or they just, I'm into crime shows, right? So all things having to do with that excite me, right? Find someone who is excited about emergency preparedness. They can be your champion, and they can be the ones to run with a lot of the initiatives that need to be done within your organization. If it's possible, create that emergency champion on every unit, in every department, on every floor, on every shift. Find that group of people that are passionate about this, and then start to incorporate emergency preparedness into every meeting. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be 30 minutes of every agenda, but at the beginning or at the end of your meeting, show a 5-minute video about emergency preparedness, or pull out one of your plans and ask a few questions just to provide that constant ongoing education. And it also shows your commitment then as a leader to this being an important value within your organization. Use a variety of tools. All you have to do is Google emergency preparedness, and you will have a wealth of information. There are videos and quizzes and drills and games and things that you can do to incorporate planning into your program or organization, and try to make it fun. And don't forget your patients, your residents. If you work in a skilled nursing facility, there may be residents who become your champions of emergency preparedness. So don't limit yourself to who those people could be. Next slide, please. It's really important, I think, to try to have this change in mindset. Yes, we are all required now because of CMS to do emergency preparedness at some level within our organizations. We have conditions of participation that we have to meet. So it has become a have to, right? But if that's all we consider emergency preparedness to be, checking the box, that is not embedding a culture. That is just simply a task that needs to be checked off at some point within your organization. Our goal here is to try to embed emergency preparedness and planning and all of that exercise and training into every aspect of your organization. And initially, those are going to feel like very shallow roots. And I think this image is really helpful to think about when you newly plant something or transplant perennials. You need to tend those, and you have to water them carefully, and you need to really spend time with them. But as the culture becomes more embedded, as those plants become more integrated into their new environment, they create those deep roots. And that's where we have the embedded culture of emergency preparedness that we are really striving for. And that's when culture is created. So we really hope that not just today, but over the course of the next 9 sessions here, that you will see that this is something that can be embedded into your daily practice or into your organizational practice, and something that we will be able to incorporate into every aspect of what we do within your organization. So let's next slide. There are some resources that I want to highlight. First of all, the Be Ready, the ready.gov preparedness videos. Again, if you're looking for snippets of things to bring to a meeting or to a staff training day, there's a lot of them. They're all free. Look to see what you may be interested in. Remember that, every month there's something, right? So it might be Fire Preparedness Month this month. It might be Severe Weather Awareness in April. Find the calendar and then start to embed those just 12 times a year within your staff meetings. There's a video on YouTube here that I thought was kind of clever. It's just one example of one that you may be able to incorporate. And then Asper Tracy, if you're not familiar with Asper Tracy, it is a repository of all things emergency preparedness. It is run at the federal level. And I'll be very honest with you, it can be very overwhelming if you're looking for a particular template or plan, but it has a great feature. And that is, if you are looking to create a plan or a template, or if you are looking to do an exercise and you don't have time to sort through all the multitude of resources that they have there, you can do a technical assistance request, and they have people that will do the research for you and then present a summary of their findings. So it is worth signing up. It's free. And if there's something in particular you're looking for, it's a great resource. Best practices. Next slide. So here's our contact information for both myself and Brian. Check out our website. We'd love to hear from you. We're anxious to see what kind of feedback we get, not just from today's presentation, but all 9 that will be coming up. And Tony, I will turn it back to you to see if how you want to manage questions. I know we don't have a ton of time, but we'd be open to anything that people have to say.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amy. While folks are thinking of any questions or any comments and putting those into chat, or if you'd like to ask a live question, you can unmute yourself. That function is on either in your picture window or at the bottom of the screen. But I just also wanted to remind folks that Superior Health is really interested in any opportunity that we can take to help you with your emergency preparedness planning, not only in terms of what kind of challenges you have or what keeps you awake at night, but also with respect to the nursing homes. We're happy to review your public health emergency preparedness plan and provide feedback using a template that we've created that actually correlates nicely with Appendix Z. So if you've downloaded the slides or you have those available, and Christy did put those in chat, for community health organizations, we just have a very short questionnaire, and would appreciate getting some feedback. And then for the nursing homes as well, it's a very short form, and you can submit your emergency preparedness plan to us, the emerging infectious disease portion. So we're not asking you to send your entire plan to us, but send what you think is appropriate, and we'll do our best to review. So let's see, Allie or Mike, are there any questions in the chat box for Amy and Brian, or any comments?
Not at this time.
So just as we're thinking about what Amy and Brian have presented today, I just wonder if there's any comments from any of our participants about maybe some ways that they're looking at kind of creating that culture that Brian and Amy have talked about, you know, how you've approached that just in terms of sharing best practices with each other.
Thank you, Brian and Amy. This is Carol with our team at Burnett Medical Center. It was really well presented and organized, and we're just going to be able to use it as we look back and analyze it. I'm here with our unit secretary and our emergency preparedness leader, and we are just grateful for this information and guidance. Thank you so much.
Awesome. That's great to hear.
You are welcome.
Any other folks who want to make any comments? We've got about 4 minutes left.
I feel the need to say, Tony, that I fully recognize that we are really in a difficult place regarding staffing right now. And it like anything else, it feels very overwhelming to add anything extra. But again, if you create a culture that is inviting and healthy and all of that, hopefully your staff is sticking around a little bit more. I know it's hard to compete with the Quick Trips and the Culvers of the world, but it's still, you know, I mean, it is an essential piece of staff retention. So it's a big long-term picture problem, but I do feel the importance of acknowledging that is a huge challenge right now.
Yes, thank you, Amy. It very much is indeed. Any other comments from our participants or any questions before we leave for today? Just as a reminder, our next session is February 16th. And as Amy, I think, and Brian both mentioned, they'll be talking more specifically about Appendix C, which is kind of like the Bible when it comes to emergency preparedness and planning. So
And prepare to hang on to your hats because we have a lot of information during that session and we will be moving through it very quickly. So come ready to listen and you will get the slides afterwards.
all right, Mike and Ally, are there any additional comments or questions?
Doesn't look like it.
All right, well, hearing none, Amy and Brian, we really appreciate your expertise and sharing information about creating a culture with us. And then we will look forward to the next session on the 16th when we kind of review the elements of Appendix C. All right, thank you so much. Take care.